actually, I'd like to ask you about your connections with Sheffield. You said music was your first.
Yeah, well, my first impressions of Sheffield were from music, really, or I guess news reports on TV of industry. But really, my personal connection with the city started through bands like Cabaret Voltaire. And I think that was probably the first time I ever encountered experimental film. I certainly wasn't from that kind of background where I was in contact with that, but I was really interested in experimental music as a youngster. So even bands that weren't from Sheffield, like Section 25, which were a band I really liked, mainly sort of electronic stuff that was really, I suppose, commenting on the fragmentation of the country and this kind of semi-apocalyptic horizon that we had at the time with nuclear war and the end of the Cold War and the dismantling of industry. It was really an interesting time, seemed to speak to me quite directly. And subsequently, a few years later, I was in a band myself after I'd been at art school for a few years, and we had a connection with Sheffield via one of the band members who'd been at university here.
What was the name of your band?
Yeah, the band was called Add-N-to-X. So one of the band members had been at college in Sheffield and had a connection with several people in music here, all of whom were doing quite different things, from sort of avant-garde electronics to dance music and more experimental stuff. So we really were sort of immersed in the whole complexion of the scene here, and there were record companies like Warp here as well at the time, and so it was it immediately spoke to me in the way that I'd anticipated it would. And somehow there's some resonance chimed, and we ended up recording here for the duration of the band, which was just a little under 10 years.
Wow.
And so we spent a lot of time in Sheffield, and I always thought of it in these terms of this place that has this kind of solidarity in terms of the people being able to sort of transform and endure through changes, but also a sense of nostalgia and loss. And I think in many respects that's what's kind of interesting about this work that I've made here.
Yeah. So, I mean, you and Martin know each other well, you've worked together before. When he invited you to come and participate in this show, did he have this building in mind when he spoke to you, or how did...
There were several buildings in mind. This one in particular, I'd walked past because I know this area really well, and a lot of my friends just live down the road in Nether Edge, and so I must have passed it thousands of times going under the roundabout, but I never necessarily questioned what it was. I know a lot of people in Sheffield have, and they're kind of obsessed about it. It's a really beautiful building. It's listed, but one of the things I was interested in was finding a place that was industrial, but also had this feeling of a bunker, really like a nuclear bunker, somewhere you perhaps could take refuge. Because in many respects, this idea of survival, this tenuous relationship, or existential relationship to the everyday, the way that industry falls apart and moves on, or the way that things and places endure, not just in Sheffield. But I thought there was a really interesting microcosm of I suppose what happens in general in the country, this kind of post-industrial, post-Cold War environment.
Insignificance.
So when did the idea of this building, when did you know that it was available?
I knew it was on the cards, and Martin invited me to come and have a look at it.
And of course you'd never seen inside it.
I hadn't seen inside it. No, I was completely blown away,
Yes.
and it just fitted every kind of remit. Except I wasn't necessarily bargaining on something so massive.
Yeah.
And in terms of music, very interesting as well, because of the reverberation immediately struck me, and it reminded me of an environment I'd been in once at a studio of a producer called Steve Albini, and he's kind of got a bunker where he has his studio, and in there he had a special kind of Faraday cage built all around it, and these plate reverbs in one room. So I immediately started to make the connection between in fact, I'd kind of had this idea already, like floating around in my head. So this was the perfect way to sort of explore it or pursue it, and so the notion of a sound that's transformed via its transmission through a material was really interesting to me. And in terms of the film, which is
did you know about the film already?
I already knew about the work that IBM were doing with that since way back. And in the 80s, the guys who originally moved atoms were using a tunneling electron microscope to photograph them, or at least make photographs from the information that they derived from rooting around with this very high-tech pin, basically, and kind of tunneling around at that level. The trouble they had was that the atoms would stick to the device, and so rather than getting rid of the device, very costly thing to do every time, they had to find a way of shedding the atoms or dislodging them from this instrument. And when they'd done that, they were delighted, but then they realised they'd been the first people to move atoms from one place to another artificially. And so it was this complete sort of epochal shift that took place.
It seems extraordinary that they'd go to all the trouble to create that amazing little clip of animation of a boy in his atom.
Yes,
which
that's right. Well, actually, it's supplementary to the work that they do. The work that they do is moving atoms around to pursue very tiny data storage.
Yeah.
So the idea, so this is the kind of thing they're doing anyway. But in order to advertise that, they obviously are able to make these very rudimentary.
So you approached them and said.
Yeah, a guy called Andreas Heinrich, who's head of the research in this field, or head of this department in San Jose at IBM. Originally the work was done by two scientists whose name temporarily escapes me in Switzerland, so I contacted via Switzerland. They said, oh no, go to San Jose. But yes, and through them I was able to get the sound of atoms being moved around, which I thought was really, for me, is absolutely, for me this kind of brings my interest in sound and I suppose the material and the spectacle all together at once. The idea of the kind of hubris that you could have from anthropocentrically projecting onto these atoms and making a little man is like the height of the Anthropocene moment, that you could actually mess with the building blocks of the world and make a little man. So for me that also spoke about this kind of Cold War period in of Sheffield, like Threads, like the Barry Hines film, and again chimed with these two things, this kind of optimism of the machine age and then the possible existential threat that engenders. And so again we're always playing with these sorts of polar opposites which seem to sort of exist on the same plane, like this power station, incredible thing that services hundreds of thousands of people, but also is this bomb basically. But here I was talking about trying to think about how you can project into the future and in the past simultaneously, and I think that's how we kind of conjure the present in a way, because it's so fugitive, we can't really talk about it. And in many respects I feel like it's easier to predict the future than it is to properly piece together the past. And so there's this material in the film which is from very early IBM artificial intelligence
the words that are being...
That's right. So there was a machine developed by IBM called AB, which stood for Auto Beatnik, and it was arguably, because there was some work being done in Germany as well, arguably the first computer poetry, the first AI creative example of that creativity. So what I wanted to do was, rather than just play the poems themselves, was to take the kind of building blocks out of them, like a sentence obviously is made up of words, but I took the kind of more or less the nouns and other sort of salient words within the structure, and then separated them into this sort of linear sort of incantation or something like that. And so hopefully that will start to kind of, by arresting an equivalence with these real building blocks, these atoms which have been formed into a man, and then this idea, this anthropocentric idea of making something human out of a machine, and I could arrest that equivalence, as well as the idea of this plate reverb, which is physically changing through its atomic structure, the information that's put in it, that somehow some kind of dialogue could exist in that room between the subject matter and the physical attributes that are in there, that was outside of my authorship. And I think most of my work is really about setting some kind of stage where an event can bring itself into being, create some kind of, I suppose, some kind of becoming world where these things are enabled to start to operate outside of the cultural parameters that we put on them, that they have some kind of potentiality of their own outside of that. What I try to set up is rather than create a illustration or a direct kind of narrative, what I want to do is try to allude to something fugitive or errant or not quite formed, or a hunch that, and by circling it, by creating enough of these trajectories or orbits around it, this kind of apsis means that there's no... my problem with authorial control is that it becomes illustrative and it shuts a thing down. And so if you impose strictures on a thing, then it only operates within a sort of envelope. And so I don't tend to work like that. Sometimes work's a little bit more direct, and I don't mind didactic work. In fact, I don't mind if I include some elements of the work which are quite illustrative. However, what I prefer to do is to create a place which can catalyse a new reading. So for me, it's very much about the viewer. And when the viewer's not there, and whatever, when the lights are off, all of these kind of changes in the state of the place, and physical changes and environmental ecologies. I mean, I use that in the broadest term, are all at play. So that everything's relative, and things like temporality. This is only on for 3 weeks, and yet somehow I think things do have a sort of resonance. And I think good art, and I'm not saying that that's what I make, but I think good art gives itself over to that place that we don't necessarily know about. It's not totally within this kind of cultural sphere. It's not within the anthropocentric. It's not epochal. It sits in a different sort of time.